I guarantee that you're reading too much on the SAT reading and writing section. My name's Ari Morrison. I'm an SAT coach. I scored a 770 on the reading and writing, despite the fact that I'm a super slow reader and I don't read for fun at all, like ever. So if you struggle with timing or accuracy on the SAT reading, like I used to, this video will definitely help you. The reading and writing section is divided into 15 types of questions, and each one of them needs to be approached and handled separately, like in its own kind of unique way. And in this video, I'm going to briefly go over the 15 types again and talk about exactly which parts of the passage you need to read and which parts you can completely ignore, and it won't hurt you at all. In fact, it's actually going to help you in two different ways. One, it's going to make the right answer stand out more obviously. And secondarily, and this is probably even more important, it's going to make the wrong answers make no sense. Like the wrong answers are going to be easy to ignore because you're ignoring the parts of the passage that they usually will come from. If you want to practice any of these question types, you could go over to patternsat.com. As far as I know, it's the only place on the internet that allows you to practice by these like 15 question types that I break it down into. Again, what's most important here is that you read exactly what you need to read and nothing that you don't. So without further ado, let's jump in. All right, let's start with areas that you don't need to read the full passage. There's a bunch of them. So let's start with overall structure questions. These are the ones that read, which choice best describes the overall structure of the text? With these ones, my general approach is read the first sentence and then look at the answer choices immediately. So the first sentence says, Hiroshi Senju is known worldwide for his paintings of waterfalls. So I would say like it's introducing some artist and saying like what he's famous for. So it introduces an artist and yada yada. Okay, that's a good start. It introduces an artist. That's definitely what it does. It explains a specific painting technique. Now, it doesn't really do that. Describes a famous painting. No, we haven't done that. It gives an opinion about an artist. No, it's not really an opinion. It's just saying he's known worldwide, which is an objective statement. So the answer is going to be A. Okay, anything that says like according to the text or based on the text, I kind of call these like details problems. That are just asking for like a specific detail about something in the text. It's not asking for the overall structure or a main idea or anything like that. So this one says, how old was the fossil that Wang and colleagues discovered? I already know I'm looking for a number, and also like all the answer choices have a number. So I'm just like kind of keying in on the numbers in the text. I see 164, I see 145 and 201. So I just need to kind of read near these numbers. For example, this one says, Jin Wang and colleagues have discovered the earliest known example of a flower bud in a 164 million year old plant fossil. Okay, it seems like that's the answer to the question. So the answer is just going to be 164. I didn't have to read the entire passage. I could kind of just like look for a keyword in the passage and read near there. The third type of question that you don't need to read the entire passage for typically is the which if true structure. And that's like which finding, if true, would most directly support or weaken some argument or conclusion. Sometimes you see this in the form of like which quote would most support this argument. And those are sometimes like fill in the blanks. But in the way I look at things, they're basically asking for the same information. They're looking for like either a support or a rejection of some argument. So when I see which if true, I'm already thinking like, okay, I need to support Muller and Harris's conclusion. So let me just zoom in and find their conclusion. Okay, I see their names right here, Zoe Muller and Stephen Harris. And they claim, so this is going to be their conclusion right here, that giraffes may even help each other care for one another's newborns. Okay, so we're looking for like a support to that idea. So giraffes may even help each other care for one another's newborns. Female giraffes have been observed feeding young giraffes that aren't their direct offspring. That already seems like probably the right answer. I would just quickly go through the others to make sure that they don't make sense. Confrontations between a younger and older male giraffe are frequently observed. That doesn't work. That's not a support for this idea. Some female giraffes have been observed sniffing and licking their newborn offspring. That's talking about their newborn offspring, not other giraffes' offspring. So that doesn't work. Giraffes are able to make sounds but are rarely observed communicating with one another. That has nothing to do with their claim. So the answer is definitely choice A. And you see how I got that just from the last sentence where their claim exists. Next up is boundaries. So these are any type of punctuation problem. And this one, I'm not even going to like go through the answer. The main point that I want to make here, which you probably already know, is you only need to read the sentence with the blank in it. So this passage happens to have two sentences. There's a period right here. So theoretically, you could go on and read all of this, but it's never going to affect the grammar of the previous sentence. So you never have to read past that sentence. I'm not sure what the answer is to this. I'm guessing it's the dash because there's a dash over here, and usually dashes come in sandwiches, but I'm not even gonna waste time like going through that. But bullet point problems, you do not need to read the entire text, meaning you don't usually need to read all the bullet points. Sometimes you don't need to read any. So here it says the student wants to indicate where the short story takes place, so the answer must have a location. Okay, Raymond's Run takes place in Harlem. That looks good. It was published in Gorilla My Love. That doesn't say a location. Gorilla My Love is obviously not a location. Is told from a first person perspective, not a location. Was written by Tony Cade Bambara, not a location. So if you read all this, you might find that like some of these are true, but they don't answer the question. And very often, only one or two of the answer choices will actually answer the question. So don't waste your time reading all of these. First, start with the question, then read the answer choices, and only if you need to, go back and read the bullet points afterwards. And finally, main idea. This I actually learned kind of recently. So I used to always tell my students to read the whole passage with main idea questions, but then when I was looking for an example to kind of prove my point, I realized that most of them you could actually answer by just reading the last sentence, and sometimes the first sentence also helps. But let's just see what this last sentence does and see how we could answer it just from that. And again, this might not work for every single question, but it definitely works on enough questions that it should be your first try when you see a main idea question. So by inserting an ultra thin sheet of graphene above the crystal, again, I have no idea what this is talking about, but we're going to try to make do with that. Of graphene above the crystal, the researchers obtain an impression, the first visual confirmation of the Wigner crystal. Okay, researchers have obtained the most definitive evidence to date of the existence of the Wigner crystal. That seems right, because here it says the first visual confirmation of the Wigner crystal and the most definitive evidence of the existence of the Wigner crystal. That seems to match really nicely. Researchers have identified an innovative new method for working with unusual crystalline structures. I use the word innovative. We don't know if this ultra thin sheet of graphene is an innovative thing. It doesn't indicate that, at least in the last sentence. So A is like kind of better than B in that sense. Graphene is the most important of the compounds required to capture an image. We have no indication of that. We know that it helps, but saying the most important is like kind of extreme language that we tend to want to avoid unless there's really strong evidence in support of it. And D says it's difficult to acquire an image because of the crystal's honeycomb structure. There's no indication of that here. Now, again, so A looks to be the right answer, and it is in this case. One huge benefit of using these like shortcut approaches is that if you read the rest of this passage, I guarantee that one or more of these wrong answer choices will be more tempting to you. You see how I was able to like cut out the noise of the other answers because I was focused in on the part of the text that was most likely to give me the correct answer. So like a lot of these answers didn't even make a lot of sense because we weren't reading all this like distractor stuff up here. Now let's go to question types where sometimes you need to read the full passage. Okay, so these are ones where sometimes you could get away with only reading a little bit or like kind of like fudging your way toward an answer without reading everything, and other times you will have to read more. So form, structure, and sense. Now these are like the grammar problems that are not punctuation. So any like verb tense or main verb or subject verb agreement, things like that. So here we have clearly like some kind of verb structure question. And here it actually follows the minority rule, or like the they rule. It, they. And if you don't know this, it's a really good shortcut. and I actually have an article on it that I'll link in the description below. So you try each word using the word it and the word they. So it focuses, that works. So this is singular, meaning it focuses. It focused does not work. It are focused doesn't work. And it were focused doesn't work. Now let's try them all with they. They focuses doesn't work. They focus works. So that's plural, P. They are focused works, P for plural. And they were focused works, P for plural. So when you get a situation like this, like 99% of the time, maybe 100% of the time, this is going to be the right answer. So I was able to do that without reading any of the passage at all, which is pretty sweet. Next up is two texts or cross-text connection. So here we have, based on the two texts, how would the author of text 1 most likely regard the situation presented in the underlined sentence in text 2? So we want the perspective of the text 1 author. So my recommendation would be start off by reading all of text 1. So read all of this, but then you only need to respond to this underlined sentence. So what I would do is I would skip all of this stuff. And you're never going to go wrong by skipping that. Like this will always work because the question specifically asks how the author of text 1 would respond to the underlined portion. So you just don't need any of this background information. So that's a pretty easy way to save some time on these types of questions. Now, for function of the underline, typically I recommend you read everything before the underlined text and then you read the underlined text. So I would recommend you read basically all that, and that, because you do need some context of what this passage is about so you understand what the underlined text is doing in the context of the passage, but usually you could get away with not reading anything after it. So let's just try this one. Genetic studies have led researchers to suggest that turtles are most closely related to the group that includes modern crocodiles. So basically, like turtles are kind of related to crocodiles, but studies of fossils suggested instead that turtles are most closely related to other groups, such as ones that have modern snakes. So it looks like first they thought one thing and then they kind of changed their mind, or they got like research that indicated that it was wrong. However, many of the fossil studies have relied on incomplete data sets. So it's kind of calling into question fossil studies that led us to believe that turtles are related to snakes. So I'm looking for something that like calls something into question. So it offers an overview of the tools, definitely not. It describes a limitation of some studies. Yeah, that's more like it. That's a limitation. They relied on incomplete data sets. That's a limitation. It summarized previous research. No, it doesn't do that. It criticizes a widely held belief about genetic studies. No, it doesn't. It doesn't criticize a widely held belief. It does criticize some genetic studies. Or sorry, no, it criticizes fossil studies, actually. This is pretty unrelated. So B is definitely the right answer. In fact, I would say for this one, you probably could have gotten it just by reading the underlined portion. So here, I don't think you needed any context to get this right, but you'll see with some harder examples that you will need a little bit more context to understand how the underlined portion is functioning within the text. Now, vocab questions. These ones you don't typically need to read the entire passage. Usually you could just read the sentence with the blank. So these plants are extremely blank to water depth during the floating leaf stage. So maybe they like water, they are extremely something to water depth. And if the water's too deep, the buoyancy, which is like I think their floating ability, like how floaty they are, of the young wild rice plants can literally uproot them. So they're kind of like vulnerable, it sounds like. If the water's too deep, then they can get uprooted. So they're extremely like vulnerable to water depth. So I'm looking for an answer choice that's like vulnerable, and I think sensitive fits the bill. They're very sensitive to water depth. So here I didn't need to read the first sentence at all. If I did, maybe it would have helped, but it also would have taken more time. So I would definitely recommend that you start by just reading the sentence in question, and then only if you feel really confused, go back and read previous sentences. table and graph evidence. So these I kind of grouped into one question type. Sometimes you'll see it with a graph, and sometimes you'll see it with a table with data in it. And here, my strong recommendation is you start by looking at the table or graph and just trying to understand your own, like, what do you take away from the graph? What are the trends that you see in the patterns that you think might be relevant? So we're talking about copper production in 3 different states. Generally, all of them are going up. So this is like 1889, they're all pretty low, then they go up a bit, and then they go up even more. So all 3 of them are going up. It's Montana, Arizona, and Michigan. Okay, so this is like a pretty simple pattern. And I guess like you could also say like Arizona started off the lowest and then like seemed to be like close to the highest, or like pretty much tied with Montana at the end. So there's also some like interstate kind of things going on where the lines are crossing each other. But we'll see. So the next thing I would do is just read the last sentence. Several states saw rapid growth in the production of this resource. I'm sure that this resource is referring to copper because that's the only resource in the graph. For example, okay, the rise in copper production in Michigan slowed. No, we're looking for something that references several states, maybe all 3 of them. Montana and Arizona produced more copper than Michigan in 1909. That's okay. That is referencing more than one state, but it's not really talking about rapid growth. It's just saying that they produce more than Michigan. It doesn't mean that there was growth. Fewer than 100 million pounds of copper were produced in Arizona in 1889. That's irrelevant to growth, and copper production rose significantly from 89 to 1909. That absolutely works. And finally, let's talk about the 3 question types where I actually recommend you read the entire passage, and I'll show you a few examples of why. So these are main purpose questions. Which choice best states the main purpose of the text? And here, if you try doing like the first last technique that we talked about with the main idea questions, you get Jackie Orm's Torchy Brown and Dixie to Harlem was the first comic strip by a Black woman to appear in a widely read newspaper. Okay, so we talk about like the first comic by a Black woman that was like popular. So I guess this was like a glass ceiling that was kind of broken. And then it says Torchy Brown, which is the name of the comic, thus shows how Orms, who's the author of the comic, used comics to comment humorously on issues affecting Black Americans, which she continued to do throughout her career. So it kind of talks about her legacy and what she was trying to do with her comic strip. Which choice best states the main purpose of the text? So this is the correct answer. And I highlighted it to show that it's kind of hard to come to without reading the entire passage. So the correct answer is to give an example of how Orms presented the experience of Black Americans in her comic strip. So we actually missed out on a whole example. Like the whole example happens in the middle here. So reading the first and last, we kind of missed what the SAT says the main purpose of the text was. So I'm not saying it's impossible for you to get the right answer by doing like first and last kind of technique, but it definitely made this harder. And this is considered to be like an easy problem. So imagine how much harder it would be with like a medium or difficult problem of the same type. Another one is logically complete the text. So which choice most logically completes the text? If you try just like reading the last sentence before the blank, it says writing in this way can be challenging and might seem as though it would produce awkward poems. However, reviewers praised One Last Word as a beautiful and powerful tribute to the poets who inspired it. The reactions suggest that Grimes successfully used the golden shovel method to achieve her goal for One Last Word. So again, is it impossible for you to come to this? I wouldn't say it's impossible because, to be honest, A, C, and D don't make a lot of sense here, but it's very challenging because we don't even know what the golden shovel method is. So in order to have context of like what the golden shovel method is, we have to at least go back here. And then the second sentence explains like what the golden shovel method is. So you're probably going to want to read the first and second sentences. So at that point, you're basically reading the entire passage. And again, all of these are like easy examples. So I'm showing you how like even in the easier examples, trying to skip out on parts of the passage doesn't reliably work. And the last one is transitions. This is partially kind of a trivial thing because most transition problems are only 2 sentences. And very often they're in this structure where it's like sentence, blank, like the transition goes here, and then the second sentence. So in order to understand what transition should go, you need to understand the relationship between the first sentence and the second sentence, which very often is the whole passage in a transition problem. So this one is like not really such a big deal because the passages are so short anyway. But I just, for the sake of completion, I wanted to show these types of problems. You almost always have to read like all of it in order to understand. So here's like the big picture summary. Don't read the full passage for overall structure, any kind of details question based on the text, and which if true, boundaries, bullet points, and main idea. Sometimes you have to read the whole thing, but sometimes not for verb questions, to texts, function of the underline, vocab, table graph evidence, and usually you do have to read the whole thing for main purpose, logically complete the text, and transitions.